song of the necromancer. I will repeat a subtle rune, and thronging suns of otherwhere shall blaze upon the blinded air, and spectres terrible and fair shall walk the riven world at noon. The star that was mine empery is dust upon unwinnowed skies, but primal dreams have made me wise, and soon the shattered years shall rise to my remembered sorcery. To mantic mutterings brief and low, my palaces shall lift amain, my bowers bloom, I will regain the lips whereon my lips have lain in rose-red twilights long ago. Before my murmured exorcism, the world a wispy wraith shall flee, a stranger earth, a weirder sea, peopled with shapes of faerie, shall swell upon the waste abysm. The pantheons of darkened stars shall file athwart the crocus dawn. Goddess and gorgon, lar and faun shall tread the amaranthine lawn, and giants fight their thunderous wars. Like graven mountains of basalt, dark idols of my demons there shall tower through bright zones of air, fronting the sun with level stare, and hell shall pave my deepest vault. Phantom and fiend and sorcerer shall serve me till my term shall pass, and I become no more, alas, than a frail shadow on the glass before some latter conjurer. That's an incantation by Clark Ashton Smith. When Smith was born in Long Valley, January 13th, 1893, the California in which he was born was very different from the California we know now. Not only would it seem to us underpopulated, it would seem unpopulated. Most of the population was in the northern part of the state. LA was mostly what would now be downtown, without the high-rises. Auburn, where he was born, well, no, actually outside it, was a small city, but still a real city. San Francisco was the city, the site of all sorts of artistic, commercial, literary adventures. And also, it was the older San Francisco, the one that had not yet been destroyed in the earthquake and the fire, which, as you know, the area destroyed was primarily the area enclosed by Van Ness and Market and Mission. There were still large areas that were not touched. Let's see, he was born in 1893. In 1912, his first book of poetry was published, The Star Trader, an amazing book. He was 18. It would have been amazing had he been 81. This is a typical, he's always in between death and life. Retrospect and forecast. Turn round, O life, and know with eyes aghast the breast that fed thee, death, disguiseless, stern. Even now, within thy mouth, from tomb and urn, the dust is sweet. All nurture that thou hast was once as thou, and fed with lips made fast on death, whose sateless mouth it fed in turn. Kingdoms debased, and thrones that starward yearn, all are but ghouls that batten on the past. Monstrous and dread, must it forever abide, this unescapable alternity? Must loveliness find root within decay, and night devour its flaming hues away? Sickening, will life not turn eventually, or ravenous death at last be satisfied? Somewhat before his first book, he was introduced through correspondence to the then poet laureate unofficial, of course, of San Francisco, George Sterling. Our correspondence was initiated between Smith and Sterling by, I think, an Edith Hamilton, or a name like that. And just as Ambrose Bierce had played mentor to George Sterling when he came to California around 1890, so Sterling, in his turn, played mentor to Smith. Though people rarely discuss Bierce as a poet, he was a poet. He largely satirical poems, but he manages to get a lot in a very small space. She jilted me, I madly cried, the grave at least can hold her. Reflecting then that if she died, it would stop her from growing older. I pitilessly sheathed the knife and sternly sentenced her to life. And see, then in 1918, the Book Club of California published a selection of Smith's Odes and Sonnets, and it had a preface by George Sterling, in which he gave high praise to the young Smith. Also, warning the reader that Smith was not someone likely to have a large readership. Then in 1922, his second major collection was published, Evany and Crystals, Poems in Verse and Prose. It was printed by the Auburn Journal. Smith himself published it. Sterling had asked him, why don't you let A.M. Robertson, who had published the Star Trek, as well as Sterling's collection, why don't you have him bring it out? Well, Smith said he didn't like the way A.M. Robinson did business. A.M. Robinson, like others, Paul Elder, they published books. So, what a pity that A.M. Robinson didn't publish it, because at least it would have gotten reviews and a greater, how you say, accessibility. I want to read a few of the poems therefrom. Like arabesque of ebony, the cypresses in silhouette fantastically cleave and fret a moon of yellow ivory. The coldly colored rays illume a leafy pattern manifold, and all the field is overscrolled with curiously figured gloom. Like arabesque of ebony, or like Arabian lattices, forever seem the cypresses before a moon of ivory. That's the opening poem, and it sets the tone for the entire volume. Smith was obsessed not only with the earthly exotic, but with the impossibly far away. Ashes of sunset. Who fares to find the sunset ere it fly, turning to light and fire the further west, shall have the veils of twilight for his quest, in all the falling of an ashen sky. On lands he shall not know, the splendor lies, a pharos on some alienated shore, in foam and purple lost forevermore, where dreams are kindled in remoter eyes. People might ask, since Smith traveled very little, where does he get these notions, besides reading, of the earthly exotic. Well, his father, Timaeus Gaylord, who grew up in England, early in life inherited an enormous amount of money, and he just went around traveling, pissing off the money and having a grand old time. And then when he was, I guess, middle-aged, he suddenly found himself in Auburn and Long Valley, and there he met Fanny Gaylord, Frances Gaylord, and they married, and they had one child. That was Clark Ashton Smith. So he was born to parents who were older. The father, I think, was 45, and the mother was 40. That's a different experience from being raised by young parents with all their energy and enthusiasm. Here's two beautiful pictures, as it were. Yeah, flamingos and palms. Flamingos. On skies of tropic evening, broad and beryl green, above a tranquil sea of molten malachite, with flare of scarlet wings and long and level flight, the soundless, fleet flamingos pass to isles unseen. They pass and disappear where darkening palms indent the horizon, underneath some high and tawny star, lost in the sunset gulfs of glowing cinnabar, where sinks the painted moon with prows of orpiment. Orpiment, by the way, is lemon yellow. Palms. Palms in the sunset of a languid summer land, sculpture of living green on dreamy scarlet light, dividing as a wall the twilight from the night. How magically still and luminous they stand, inclining fretted leaves above some red lagoon, careless alike in mystic and immense repose of the flamingo-colored flying sun that goes, or the slow coming of the lion-colored moon. His third major collection, Sandalwood, was published in 1925, in late 1925. Smith's craftsmanship, by the way, is impeccable. This is a very poignant poem. We shall meet. We shall meet once again in the strange and latter summers, and recall, like olden mummers, an old play of love and pain. I shall greet you, not with kisses of the days aforetime, knowing these will fall vain as those of phantoms blowing nightward to the last abysses. Faint perfume will attend you like a scrying imprisoned myrrh, and my dreaming heart, where fallen autumns stir, half their fallen light will lend you. From the tomb, love shall rise mutely in a spectre's fashion to the seeming lamps forever bleak and ashen of our necromantic eyes. But no tear shall we weep, knowing tears are void and vain, like the scattered drops of rain on a desert's iron sleep. Chill and sere, like the grass flapping in a field of snow, we shall know that nothing mattered as we tell our faded woe ere we pass. Flapping, by the way, means fluttering or flapping. It's a Scottish dialectic, lovely word. And also seems to be maybe an existential statement there, if the latest findings and thinking about the cosmos are true. Nothing mattered means nothing brought forth matter. Well, this is a this would make a wonderful well, the beginning of an anthology of Smith's poetry. Enchanted mirrors. These are enchanted mirrors that I bring, by demons wrought from metals of the moon to burnished forms of loon or plenilune. Therein are fairy faces vanishing and warm Pompeian phantoms lovelier than mortal flesh or marble, and the gleam of Atlantean suns that rose in dream and sank on golden worlds that never were. Therein you shall behold unshapen dooms and ghoul astounding shadows of the tombs, oblivion with eyes like poppy buds, or love with blossoms plucked in Devachan, paradise. In stillness of the lily-pillared woods, but nevermore the moiling world of man. Of a special excellence in Smith's output, he's one of the few poets in English who have cultivated the poem in prose, which is primarily a French genre, more or less coming into existence in the early 1840s, thanks to a remarkable book, the only one that the author lived to complete, Gaspard de la Nuit, Gaspard of the Night. And they're all, it's an incredible evocation largely of medieval Europe, different cities and so forth. Well, Smith happened to have a copy of Pastels in Prose, which was published in the early 1890s, an anthology of poems in prose in translation from the works, I don't know, 23 or 24 French poets. And Smith learned the technique of the poem in prose from that volume. He also, of course, knew prose of such masters as Sir Thomas Browne. This is one example. It's called The Broken Lute. Because you are silent to my lyric prayers, deaf to the melodies that I have made from the sighs and murmurs of a wounded love, I have broken my golden lute and cast it away, tarnished and unstrung among the red leaves and faded roses of the September garden. Silence, the silver dust of lilies, the mournful, muted wind of autumn, and the fitfully drifting leaves have claimed it for their own. Seeing it there, as you pass on your queenly way amid the crumbling roses, will you not echo one sigh of the many sighs which, as a music for your pleasure, were breathed from its chords during the summer's half-forgotten days? From the poems in verse, regular poems, to the poems in prose, and then from the poems in prose to his later fiction, there is the poems in prose lead directly into his fiction. As for example, The Flower Devil, a poem in prose, became the nucleus for a story called The Demon of the Flower. Two others, From the Crypts of Memory and The Shadows, lead directly to The Planet of the Dead. In fact, I mean, literally, he reused some of the same language. There is in Smith, especially his poem, some of the poems in prose, and also some of his prose fictions, a curious voice, a curious tone that I call one of awe, as in awful or awesome. And this is a good example. I hope my voice will stand up to it. always with Smith, I feel like I should have a voice of brass that would resonate all over the place. Well, I don't quite have that. This is the Memnons of the Night. Oh, and another thing I forget. Like Sterling's own poetry, Smith's poetry is full of the cosmos, such as never been limned before, not associated with any particular modern religions. So it gives a sharpness to what he's talking that I have never found in anybody else. The Memnons of the Night. Ringed with a bronze horizon, which at a point immensely remote seems welded with the blue brilliance of a sky of steel, they oppose the black splendor of their porphyritic forms to the sun's insuperable gaze. Reared in the morning twilight of primeval time by a race whose towering tombs and cities are one with the dust of their builders in the slow lapse of the desert, they abide to face the terrible latter dawns that move abroad in a starkness of fire, consuming the veils of night on the vast and sphinx-like desolations. Level with the light, their tenebrific shadow-making, their tenebrific brows preserve a pride as of Titan kings. In their lidless, implacable eyes of staring stone is the petrified despair of those who have gazed too long on the infinite. Mute as the mountains from whose iron matrix they were hewn, their mouths have never acknowledged the sovereignty of the suns that pass in triumphal flame from horizon unto horizon of the prostrate land. Only at eve, when the west is like a brazen furnace, and the far-off mountains smolder like ruddy gold in the depth of the heated heavens, only at eve, when the east grows infinite and vague, and the shadows of the waste are one with the increasing shadows of night, then, and then only, a music rings to the bronze horizon, a strong, a somber music, strange and sonorous, like the singing of black stars or a litany of gods that invoke oblivion. A music that thrills the desert to its heart of adamant and trembles in the granite of forgotten tombs till the last echoes of its jubilation, terrible as the trumpets of doom, are one with the black silence of infinity. That tone sometimes reappears in, or resounds in some of his prose poems, his prose fictions. This is the opening paragraph of The Dark Eidolon. On Zothique, the last continent of earth, the sun no longer shone with the whiteness of its prime, but was dim and tarnished, as if with the vapor of blood. New stars without number had declared themselves in the heavens, and the shadows of the infinite had fallen closer. And out of the shadows, the older gods had returned to man, the gods forgotten since Hyperborea, since Mu and Poseidonus, bearing other names but the same attributes. And the elder demons had also returned, battening on the fumes of evil sacrifice and fostering again the primordial sorceries. I would never mistake that for Edgar Guest. No disrespect to him. There's no copies here, but for those of you seriously into Smith's poetry, there's an anthology of it created by S.T. Joshi and David Schultz and published by Hippocampus Press, who seem to have been publishing all the elder classic poets of California, like George Sterling, Clark Ashton Smith, Nora Mae French. By the way, we live at a time of an unparalleled abundance of poets who often will have their works published by a variety of sources, but to have your complete output in verse republished as completely as possible, that doesn't happen so often. And thanks to Hippocampus Press under Derek Hussey, that has happened. All of Smith's poems and his translations of poems are now available, both in hardcover and the trade paperback. And also, because of Smith, they've issued in hardcover as Smith in 3 volumes, the complete works of George Sterling. George Sterling's wrote quite a few poetic dramas, some of which have been performed, and they seem to work. I don't know if they would do well on Broadway, but that's not the issue. And they occupy considerable space, and they are equivalent to Smith's prose fictions in bulk. We'll go back to the chronological development of Clark Ashton Smith. In the latter 1920s, a good friend advised Smith, a lady friend, that since poetry was not remunerative, that he might consider writing stories for some of the then pulp magazines. Smith, by the way, I don't think ever had a regular job, but he did work seasonally, a fruit picker, a fruit packer, and in odds and ends, which, by the way, physically is demanding work. Smith, when he was about the time of the Star Trek, he had a nervous breakdown and afflicted with incipient tuberculosis, but he didn't go to a sanatorium. I guess somehow or other it didn't bother him anymore. As the result of Evany and Crystals, Smith was called the Poe, or the Baudelaire of California. This was when one of the reviews given to Evany and Crystals. However, I think it was more the Poe rather than Baudelaire. As a person, Smith was totally distinct from Baudelaire. I had been slowly working up to a negative estimate of Baudelaire as a person, and then reading one of the selected essays of Eliot, I found the perfect indictment. To the eye of the world, and quite properly for all questions of private life, Baudelaire was thoroughly perverse and insufferable. A man with a talent for ingratitude and unsociability, intolerably irritable, and with a mulish determination to make the worst of everything. If he had money, to squander it. If he had friends, to alienate them. If he had any good fortune, to disdain it. He had the pride of the man who feels in himself great weakness and great strength. Having great genius, he had neither the patience nor the inclination, had he had the power, to overcome his weakness. On the contrary, he exploited it for theoretical purposes. The morality of such a course may be a matter for endless dispute. For Baudelaire, it was the way to liberate his mind and give us the legacy and lesson that he has left. Geniuses are not always easy people to live with. There's no denying the fact that Baudelaire was a magnificent poet. But I don't know if I would have wanted him as a close friend. Ashton Smith, on the other hand, was the antithesis of Baudelaire. He grew up with his mother and father in the countryside, relatively few people around him. He was modest, self-effacing, a little self-ironic, and nonetheless he knew his own value as a great poet and a great fictioneer, working in the form of the short story. He has had to wait for his recognition at large and for a school of poets following aspects of his own considerable output in verse. Another thought or quote, this time from Yeats. A poet is justified not by the expression of himself, but by the public he finds or creates. A public made by others ready to his hand if he is a mere popular poet, but a new public, a new form of life if he is a man of genius. And that indeed is what is happening. Excuse me. Forgive me. I've been fighting this cold since Wednesday. I don't know how much longer my voice will last. Smith died in 1961, the middle of August. He had married Carol Jones Dorman in late 1954. They had been introduced by mutual friends. So he moved from where he was living on Indian Ridge or Boulder Ridge to Pacific Grove. So that his wife, Carol, provided him with a nice, warm home the last part of his life. Excuse me. And he did not do much writing. He still continued doing poems, but so when you have a favorite author and you say, why isn't this person continuing to write? Well, people get older, they have less energy. And also, the imagination isn't what it is when you're younger. When you're younger, you feel invincible, invulnerable, as it were. So it was nice to know that he didn't have to spend the last part of his life alone, although he was accustomed to living by himself. He nursed both his mother and his father until they died. His mother died in latter 35, his father in latter 37. No sooner had his father died, I think it was December of 37, than that following January, two people showed up on his doorstep. The dancer and dance teacher, Madeline Green, and her husband, Eric Barker, who I believe he had come from England, and they had been introduced to Smith's poetry via somebody in San Francisco, some doctor. So they wanted to meet him. Well, so where he had had his mother and father, now he had Eric and Madeline, and it made an enormous difference in his life. They became very close. I think Madeline at that time was living in San Rafael. She eventually moved to San Francisco because it was easier for her to maintain a dance studio there in North Beach. At one point, I met her and Eric. We spent Christmas Day together, and then I gave her, she would give me a meal. I was working for the state in Oakland at that time, and I was giving her lessons in French conversation. Eric needed, he worked as a caretaker in some estate down in Big Sur. So every now and then we would get together. Eric was not an ordinary husband. He let Clark and Madeline have an affair, which made a huge difference to Smith. Shelley, Shelley's wife, Shelley's friend. And then they introduced Clark to Carol Jones Dorman, and they fell in love, and that's how they got married. And then Clark moved down to Pacific Grove. I recently went down there. I hadn't been in that area since the late 1950s, and I had forgotten what a picturesque and beautiful area it is. Rather well populated by wealthy people who protect their turf quite zealously. Well, since my voice doesn't seem to be improving, I'll finish at least the part on Smith with, he wrote this poem. It was included in the Dark Chateau, a small collection, one of two, published by Arkham House. The creation of Arkham House to give greater permanence to the works of H.P. Lovecraft benefited many other writers, including Smith. August Derleth, a noted regionalist, set up Arkham House primarily to give greater permanence to Lovecraft's remarkable fiction. And his second concern, once he realized there was some kind of market, was to also preserve Smith. However, Arkham House went beyond that. And if for a while Derleth supported the Arkham House through his own earnings, the last 10 years of Derleth's life, it was supporting him. There's a remarkable poem in the Dark Chateau, which appeared in late 1961, and it then appeared in the issue of Weird Tales, and it's called A Golden-Tongued Romance. It's a quote from a sonnet by Keats, which I think is on reading or rereading King Lear. This is a sort of I was discussing this poem with a friend, and he looked at me and he said, "Smith is talking about himself." And I said, "Yes." I said, it's an emotional statement, but you would not gather anything about Smith's personal life. But since he was born at you can say that the Romantic period began in the late 1700s and more or less ended with World War I, which began in 1914. So he is commenting on himself as a protagonist, or shall we say, of literary romance. And it's in the same meter and stanza form as The Raven. We found, we knew it dimly, within a dead life grimly, by guarding time inurned. A glamour far and olden, a fulgur, night enfolden, a flame that in long darkling Eden burned. Though hardly then we claimed it, we yet adored and named it, with a name forgotten now, a fairy word and dawn-like, a word of gramarye, gone like an opal bird from off a purple bough. Ah, vain the lamp reluming, the unhaunted vault inhuming the cold canopic jar. In vain the charm recovered, from out the demon hovered, worm-troubled page, of pentacled grimoire. And yet the thing we yearn for, the thing that we return for, from tomb in catacomb, it may not wholly dwindle, while moon or meteor kindle a phantom beacon on the ebon foam. Through ghoul-watched wood unthridden, by goblin mere and midden, no ivory horn will blow, no gold lamp lighten gloom ward, but we will carry doom award, the broken beauty caught from long ago. An echo half evading the ear, remotely fading from a far vibrant lyre, a long-plucked flower blooming in the dry urn, a fuming, myrrh-fragrant ember in a darkened pyre. Barry Kennedy asked me that I should maybe explain. I have continued certain aspects of the California Romantics, including George Sterling, Norma French, and of course Clark Ashton Smith. However, I didn't become a poet until in the winter of 1961. Various friends, knowing my taste, said, you should read The Fairy Queen, the great epic by Edmund Spenser. And so I thought I would try reading it. And well, I read the first canto, and I said, I'll never get through this. So then I read it to myself. Then I read it aloud. What a difference. So from that time, I could hear this incredibly beautiful melody coming from far away. And it took me from February or March until June or July of '61. I was also working and doing the things you must do to stay alive and having a life besides, but it so impressed me that I started writing. I had written some poetry when I was much younger, quite incompetent. I had no idea what I was doing, especially since I work in traditional forms. There are still such people. And like Smith, I have a preference for what they call pure poetry. Our Lady of the Unicorn. Litany en l'honneur d'elle. Litany in honor of her. À mon seul désir, to my one desire. Motto from a late medieval tapestry, which is one of a series in the Cluny Museum, which is on the left bank in Paris. She holds forevermore in fee all ties, all treasures of the sea, but never would she flout or scorn the empire of the rose and thorn, or yet the kingdoms of the dew, or those of cypress and the yew. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. Where coldest ocean currents run, in seas below the midnight sun, cloud-born, she hovers in the air to watch the sport and frolic there of one-horned narwhals through the waves, like jousting knights with ivory staves. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. Where gardens gleam with rose and leaf, with promise of delight or grief, she stands amid the shadowed brake, by fountains gushing near a lake, to wait for that one sure to come, driven there by his heart's own drum. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. where morning dew and evening dew with gems and filigree bestrew their traceries, their treasure troves, upon the fields, upon the groves. She skims above the level grass like phantom gliding over glass. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. Where graveyard cypress, graveyard yew, and grimmest ilex oak endue the silent space between the tombs with but the purest gloom of glooms. She watches through the midnight hours to heed the bloom of ebon flowers. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. Attended in her tented bourne by maiden, lion, unicorn, she looms inside the tapestry amid its figured imagery, where, summing all of love and fear, the motto reads, "À mon seul désir," to my one desire. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. So, thus and yea, yes, in this way, to trumpets or to lutes at play, whether by night or yet by day, she holds forevermore in fee all tides, all treasures of the sea, but never would she flout or scorn the empire of the rose and thorn, or yet the kingdoms of the dew, nor those of cypress and the yew. She of the pure and only horn, Our Lady of the Unicorn. Elle, de l'unique et pure corne, voilà Notre-Dame à la licorne. Thank you. If anybody has any questions or comments, I would be very pleased to attend to them.
What are your thoughts on the reasons why Smith stopped writing prose fiction in 36 or 37? Why do you think he stopped writing?
Who?
Smith, fiction.
Oh.
So early in his life.
Good question. I think he was just tired. After taking care of both parents through their terminal illness, and he had been turning out a lot of fiction, and although he had a certain facility, needless to say, he often subjected his best stories to multiple revisions. And then like Flaubert or like Virgil would go into some lonely part of the woods and he would sound these sentences aloud. So not very many writers still do that sort of thing. Yes, between about the late 1920s and the latter 1930s, he turned out easily, I would say, about 150 stories. Some say 100, but it's actually more than that. Also, stories that weren't accepted for one reason or another. So when Madeline Green and Eric Barker came along, it gave him the chance to do some living, and then he did get back to writing, but it was mostly poetry. I think, quite frankly, he became burned out, and the fact that the parents had died, he didn't need the income from his the fiction, which was largely published in pulp magazines, wonder stories, the beginning of science fiction in America, thrilling wonder stories, then later on astounding stories which became analog, and John Campbell publishing stories very different from Smith's or from Lovecraft's. And as I said, and also he didn't like the restrictions that were imposed on the writers for the pulp magazines. And also he had also did a lot of paintings from early on in his life, and in about the time in the mid-30s or so, he discovered sculptures which he made out of talc, and they're small. He could hold them in his hand, and talc is a relatively soft substance. And he could he did do several larger sculptures. One is Eyal de Beoth, who is a character in some novel by Anatole France. That's heavy. It's basalt. He had to use a chisel with that. Basalt, I believe, is harder than granite. I'm not a mineralogist. If I were one, I would maybe appreciate Smith more often because he has many references to minerals and gems, semi-precious stones. Well, if there any other comments? Yes.
You had described Clark Ashton Smith as being self-ironic.
In my hearing,
you described Clark Ashton Smith as being self-ironic. I was wondering if you meant in his personal life, or is it reflected in his writing?
Yes, self-ironic. I mean, he knew that he was a great poet. Besides, quite a few people had told him that, including his mentor, George Sterling. But one time he was describing something that had not yet been published, a play, which might work on the stage. It's called The Dead Will Cuckold You, and he refers to it as one of his masterpieces. Well, it could very well be, but he didn't refer to it as a piece of junk. But I really don't know how you would stage it because there's a fire takes place. How are you going to simulate that without actually burning the theater down, which would be, of course, counterproductive, never mind the danger to the poor spectators. Yeah, had he become better known, I don't know how that would have affected him. I think it's important to any artist to have recognition. You discover a community of like-minded people. Not the same as, let's say, a rock star, but a different thing because you're communicating through a rather complicated medium, which is writing, with all that that implies. And at least he had the freedom to do whatever he wanted. He didn't have a whole choir of critics telling him, oh, what to do. That reminds me of this funny couplet by Bierce. It's called The Discoverers. In the last part of Bierce's life, he got together a lot of his material. A lot of it had been published in newspapers. And the critics in the East didn't always know who he was. Or they were maybe... So, the discoverers, how my fame rings out in every zone. 1,000 critics shouting, he's unknown. And as Bierce in writing mentioned to the Sterling that West Coast writers weren't always accorded, they weren't handled with kid gloves by the critics back in New York City. This was even, the 1890s. And some of the authors were relative bestsellers. A friend of Smith's in Auburn, Jackson Gregory, wrote wonderful, very successful westerns. Material comparable to the novels of Edgar Rice Burroughs or Peter B. Kyne or James Oliver Curwood, the Canadian writer. And these writings, or Zane Grey for that matter, but that, I suppose, wasn't considered the highest form of literature, but at least it was excellent entertainment.
What was his name?
Jackson Gregory.
Gregory.
Yeah. And Smith, they knew each other and there was mutual respect. So when Jackson Gregory's sister, Susan Gregory, issued a small volume of poetry, Smith was very pleased to write quite a nice introduction. One says positive things in a preface. Why not? And I think if you can't really say something good about something, I mean in terms of creativity, maybe it's better to say nothing at all. Because people will always remember that. Be kind. It works. That doesn't mean you have to compromise standards or anything. So, any other? Yes.
Is it true that he would throw some sculptures down, like he would sculpt them and then just throw them around the Auburn area, like on the ground?
Sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, could you people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry about my, yeah, I'm sorry.
Is it
Oh, am I
he would
in
do,
the
like,
way?
little sculptures and throw them, like, just throw them on the ground and just, they'd be just around the Auburn area in the dirt? Is that-
You the Stones?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting. The house in which he was born, the house of the Gaylords, is now surrounded by these muck mansions. He had an uncle, Ed Gaylord, and his house was near a mine. So as a kid, before they moved to Boulder Ridge, where Smith's father built a sort of a cabin, I guess, he would investigate those areas. So he did go into mines where he would find talc and other substances. Relatively soft materials like laterite or limestone, which when exposed to the air hardens with age. For those of you who have been to Angkor, that's mostly a soft stone, which through the centuries has become hardened. I don't know how many people have ever been to Southeast Asia. It's an incredible place. Really one of the wonders of the world. You can't see ancient Rome, but you can see ancient Angkor, including in Angkor Wat, which is immense. And then there's Angkor Thom. I'm sorry Smith could never have gone to a place like that. And right in the middle of it is the so-called Bayon. And that's the place you see in some of these adventure movies where quite a few towers and there are these smiling Buddhas looking down at you from different angles. It's kind of kaleidoscopic. And then there's the Western tourists with their gigantic cameras, these huge lenses. They look like weapons. And sometimes I notice people, oh, did you have a good time? Oh, there were all those tourists there. I felt not disdainful. I said, wow, I felt a fraternity with these people. They had spent a heck of a lot of money to go to that place and spend more money. No, I don't feel superior to them. It was fun, especially. I never take pictures except in my head. Well, if there's any other.
I don't want to ask a question because I'm sure a lot of other people would like to ask questions, but I wanted to introduce Darin. Darin is a good friend of mine, and Darin is actually working on a documentary with Donald on Clark Ashton Smith. And also I wanted to mention that, oh, and you're going to do a talk sometime this next year at the Sacramento Book Collectors Club on this documentary. But I also wanted to mention that this Friday evening, Donald is going to give a talk on Edmund Spencer, one of my favorite poets, at the Sacramento Book Collectors Club. So everyone's invited Friday evening at 7 o'clock at the Arcade Library. So please come.
When do you, Darin, when do you think the documentary might be?
Hopefully by next summer.
Okay.
It'll be done, hopefully.
A lot more work.
Yes.
I think we're the talking heads at last. We've photographed areas in and around Auburn, Long Valley, then Crater Ridge, which is the locale of the frame story for The City of the Singing Flame, one of his most extraordinary tales. And then we just went down to Pacific Grove. It's such a beautiful area that is. So I wish Darin all the luck with his documentary. And the thing that sort of amazes me, there's a great deal of attention focused on Lovecraft. And it's only now, 53, 54 years after Smith's death, that someone has thought to do a documentary while things haven't changed, you know, too much. Or because, oh, that house is going to be removed and there's going to be a huge development there or something else like that. And Lord only knows how much longer I'm going to last, although I'm pretty sturdy so far. Well, thank you, and I thank you so much for coming, and I hope you learned something. There are what's it? Oh yes, the mute, inglorious Miltons in our midst. Not all of them are mute though, and not all of them are inglorious. Yes.
I first discovered Clark Ashton Smith when I was around 14 years old. Lancer
How
Books,
old?
Around 14.
Okay.
Lancer Books had put out these series of books like Hyboria, Zothique, Experiment.
Oh yes, yes.
And at the time, I was going through this crazy thing, reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. What I want to know is, how is it that Lovecraft has gained in popularity and hardly anybody really gets exposed to Smith as much? I mean, outside.
Lovecraft has actually led many people to Smith.
I mean,
I there's a whole thing I had not even discussed, and I should do this very rapidly. I was in the service, stationed at a base in outside Miami, and some very enlightened librarian in the base library had gotten various books from Arkham House, but mostly science fiction anthologies edited by August Derleth, who was the owner of it. And so I saw these constant references to Arkham House, so I wrote to them, and the August Derleth answered my letter and sent me all this material, and I eventually ordered a whole bunch of books. However, being in the service is not very convenient to be carrying around all these extra books, so at some point I sent them back home to my mother, well, in her house. And when I became interested in him, the 50s and 60s, Smith was not exactly unknown, but he had become known to the people that read the books of the Book Club of California and these pulp magazines. But in a sense, he hovered on the edge of oblivion. But the real breakthrough came through with Lynn Carter, because of the enormous success of Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, which is, of course, a magnificent achievement. Lynn Carter went in and talked to Ian and Betty Ballantyne and said, why don't you consider, you know, do other books of fantasy and so forth. Well, actually sometimes science fiction. So the adult fantasy series came out, and they published 3 volumes by Smith. They were going to do a 4th, but the Ballantynes canceled. They said the series had done well, but it hadn't done as well as the Tolkien, which maybe was a little unrealistic. And then but that alerted a lot of people simply to the existence of Smith and his writings. Then in the, that was the early 70s. Then in the early 80s, another series of mass market paperback. You know, you could go into a supermarket or a cigar store and what? I remember I was working at a place in the Mission Mission District in San Francisco, and I remember one day going to this corner cigar store. I forgot, I was going to get a candy bar or something, and here's this big circular rack, and the 3 Impostors by Arthur Machen. I was astonished. Machen is an author that appeals to people who appreciate a beautiful style, among other things, and he's rather a subtle writer in some respects. And then, well, Recently, let me see, with this, about, yeah, shortly after 2000, I keep forgetting we are in the 21st century, a Hippocampus Press was established by Derek Hussey. It was S.T. Joshi, the foremost scholar in the field, who suggested, why don't you start your press? And I guess they've done very well for what it is. And I don't know if you people follow the destiny of the big publishers in New York, but I don't know how many years it's been, but people who were not book people took over the running of the big houses, and they didn't know anything about books, and they didn't appreciate the fact that books have the book industry has always survived on a relatively small profit margin, 5 or 10%, and they thought they were going to change that. Well, books are not apples and oranges, wouldn't you agree? And so now because of now these handheld devices, iPod, iPad, laptop, and all these other things, they're in trouble. Whereas the small presses are doing quite well because they recognize something important. It's called limitations. If you have a limited income, you live within that, or you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble eventually. No, well, we don't have debtor's prison here. The big houses and the big publishing houses in Europe, they're doing okay. They're weathering the storm. I don't think books are going to disappear. I see these various new forms of technology. It's just one more thing coming along. You can walk, you can be on a horse, you can have a carriage, you can have an automobile, you can take a train, you can take a plane. These are all different forms. They're not necessarily going to disappear just like that. At least I hope so. And besides, they think that books are going to disappear. Has anybody ever thought, say, how many books are in existence right now? And I will say this: there is something beautiful about a book. It's a marvelous invention. The convenience. You have a whole world here, whether it's about the everyday or the very far away. I am a complete bibliophile. I will read all sorts of things in paperbacks, pocket books, but there's something breathtaking about a beautiful book in a slipcase with lovely art. Oh, I should mention that Centipede Press, which is in Teller near Denver, is bringing out 2 gorgeous books dealing with Smith. And the second one is his Avalon stories. That's the volume that was canceled because the adult fantasy series. And it's the one body of material that has some kind of mass market potential. Things aren't quite so grim in those stories and some of Smith's other stories. They have a lot of charm. And anybody who knows French or likes the concept of medieval France, it's Avalon, obviously, is based on the Auvergne, in the middle of which I believe is Clermont-Ferrand, where they make automobiles, the Citroën. I spent several nights on the outskirts of, and the Auvergne is breathtakingly beautiful. Low mountains. In fact, it's the heart of the Massif Central, which is an extension from the Alps, so that they have real winter there, but it's not terribly high. More like a plateau of hills and so forth. Anyway, the Avalon book is going to be stunning. By the way, Centipede Press books, they do very limited editions and they're not cheap. Anyway, I'm very pleased because somehow or other somebody else was supposed to be bringing this book out. It's 35 years since it was accepted, so I'm glad this Jared Walters is bringing the book out. And it's going to have some remarkable, I can't call it illustrations, some remarkable artwork by David Ho, I think is an artist that lives in the Bay Area. There is a problem with Smith because he creates such pictures in the mind, his prose and his poetry, that illustrations seem redundant. Maybe decorations are okay, but this artist has gone way beyond that. Now that I've seen some of these, I can't get them out of my head. The Enchantress of Celea. I love Smith's women characters, especially when they're young and beautiful. And she is coming out of her bath in a freshwater pond, and you see her from the rear, and she is exquisitely beautiful. You generally don't come upon women in that condition. Must be a fantasy or something. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.